In regards to our own ecclesiastical establishment, it is with the reluctance of honest grief I feel compelled by truth and duty to rank it in its present crisis, or rather convulsion, under the category of degenerate churches. In doing so, I am influenced by no unfriendly disposition, and disclaim the extraordinary modern principle that would make a Jonah of all state religion and toss it overboard. I believe the truth of the beautiful aphorism that education is the cheap defence of nations, and accord with the father of the Scottish Reformation that more of the wealth of the land should be devoted to it. It is unquestionably the first duty of Christian civil rulers to provide liberally, and not with a niggardly economy, for the moral and religious instruction of the community. But the efficiency of such an institute depends upon its character of scriptural purity. This everyone has a right to investigate, and to shut our eyes and be silent amidst scenes of acknowledged affection and corruption would be to connive at them, and the reverse of kindness. Quote, "Let the righteous smite me, it shall be a kindness," unquote. Quote, "First pure, then peaceable," unquote. I shall, therefore, quote, "nothing extenuate, nor set down aught in malice," unquote. And lest my impartiality be suspected, or that the alleged evils are in, quote, "the optics seeing, not the objects seen," unquote, I shall be careful to advance nothing in speaking of others but what is commonly known and admitted, or rests on authority not to be questioned. According to an intelligent elder in her communion, at the period of the Revolution, the Presbyterian Church of Scotland, quote, "it might be said, had to be formed anew," unquote. Here a footnote, George Buchanan, Esquire of Kellow. After a suspension of 30 years, the General Assembly was again convened by royal authority in 1690. The Church being wholly constituted by the state, a naked confession of faith, without the scripture proofs of its doctrines, without the catechisms, covenants, directory for worship, and act explicative, 1647, was then subjoined to an Act of Parliament and given as her legally ratified standard. And as such, she has always acknowledged it since. But like the Church of England, her orthodoxy has consisted chiefly in the formality of subscription, as there has all along been a numerous party who preached and published doctrines entirely at variance with it. The old Presbyterian ministers who survived the persecution had for the most part been indulged and deserved censure for their obsequious, sinful compliances, but they were generally accounted good men and sound in their religious principles. The civil power, however, was pleased to make a kind of compulsory grant on easy terms, prescribed by itself, of some 300 or 400 of prelatical incumbents who had been forced upon prostrated parishes by a brutal soldiery in 1662, and, quote, "the killing time," unquote, which followed. Though Arminians of the first water are infinitely worse, they were courteously received. Dr. Burnet, Bishop of Salisbury, an Arminian who knew them well, and being himself of the same order, was not likely to injure them by stating more than was true, says, quote, "The new incumbents who were put in the places of the ejected preachers, were generally mean and despicable in all respects, the worst preachers I ever heard. Ignorant to a reproach, and many of them openly vicious, a disgrace to their orders and sacred function, the dregs of the northern parts. Those of them who rose above contempt or scandal were men of such violent tempers that they were as much hated as the others were despised," unquote. He elsewhere adds, quote, "that they had little learning, less piety, and no sort of discretion," unquote. Nor did they seem from his later descriptions to have improved nearer the Revolution. And this representation of them is fully confirmed by a person in communion with the Church at that period, who was well acquainted with their doctrine and character. The influence of their ministrations was attested by the last words of Marion Harvey on the scaffold in 1681. Quote, "I am," said she, "about 20 years of age. At 4 and 15 I was a hearer of the curates and indulged, and while I was a hearer of these, I was a blasphemer and Sabbath breaker, and a chapter of the Bible was a burden to me," unquote. No wonder this poor girl was then a blasphemer, for profanity was sometimes uttered in the very pulpit. Just as the curate of Blantyre rose one Sabbath to pronounce the blessing, on perceiving a slight annoyance, he swore so furiously that the people apprehended they were betrayed into the hands of the Highland host, then ranging the country. And here a footnote, account of John Brown, etc., page 4. And this, it is said, was, quote, "nothing to the scandalous lives of others who were guilty of such things as were not even to be named," unquote. Well might pious Mary ask her royal consort, quote, William, can these dry bones live? Unquote. Such being the principles and character of the hundreds of episcopal divines gifted by the state, the infusion of such a mass could not fail to contaminate and, quote, leaven the whole lump, unquote, at the very beginning. Within 20 years after the Revolution, Mr. Simpson, professor of divinity in the University of Glasgow, taught, among other principles equally unscriptural, quote, that the souls of children are as pure and holy as the soul of Adam was in his original condition, being inferior to him only as he was formed in a state of maturity, that the light of nature, including tradition, is sufficient to teach men the way of salvation, and that it is not above the reach of our natural ability to use the means of salvation which God has appointed and promised to bless with such seriousness, sincerity, and faith of being heard as to secure the communication of saving grace, unquote. And the fountain being thus poisoned, the minds of the students could not fail to be tainted. Accordingly, by the year 1735, one had delivered a discourse against the Christian revelation, and another had delivered one against the standards of the Church. Here a footnote. See the index of the unprinted Acts of Assembly, 1735. There was certainly at this time in Scotland, says Henry Moncrief, a class of preachers who besides the absurd affectation of bringing their pulpits instructions from Socrates, Plato, or Seneca, rather than from the morality of the gospel, distinguished themselves by an ostentatious imitation of Francis Hutcheson, author of A System of Moral Philosophy, and the Earl of Shaftesbury. Here a footnote, Life of John Erskine, Doctor of Divinity, page 57. During the millennium of moderatism from the middle of the last century, which some regard the golden age of the Church's history, the doctrines of the gospel were miserably perverted, and the standard of ministerial character, duty, and even literature extremely low. The supernatural mysteries of revelation were repudiated, and a bare-weight philosophic soul-deadening morality suited to the gust of deists substituted in their room. It is true, in that period, many bright stars adorned the galaxy of Scottish literature and philosophy, but the light of these luminaries was darkened itself to the pious of the land, accustomed to gaze on light divine, beaming forth in the Bible. The spirit of the age was a skeptical philosophy, and those in the Church who rose to eminence in the world of letters sacrificed the interests of their flocks and the duties of their office. To the peasantry, who had on the Sabbath evenings been religiously instructed by their gray-haired fathers, these gems appeared as but feeble specks in a murky horizon, but their brilliance at best resembled moonbeams shining on mountains of snow, clear but very cold. Dr. Robertson, the celebrated historian whose genius then directed the Church, is estimated very low in respect of religious character by Mr. Wilberforce. His famous sermon on, quote, the situation of the world at the time of Christ's appearance, unquote, has been justly thought to undermine that branch of the evidence of the truth of Christianity which arises from the success of its first publishers. His coadjutors, Logan and Home, cultivated the favor of the tragic muse. They wrote and published plays, and their brethren acted in the rehearsal of them. In Logan's Sermon on Early Piety there is a charming Pelagian description of the purity and innocence of children and young persons. His biography informs us that he was guilty of, quote, certain irregularities in conduct rather incongruous with the sacredness of ministerial character, unquote. But the greater number of his hymns on devotional themes, breathtaking, like his sermons, incidental sentiments of doubtful orthodoxy, have been adopted into the liturgy of psalms used by the national church. Here a footnote. Hymn number 3, 4, 5, etc.